Dr. Jada Reynolds settled into her first-class seat, letting out a long, quiet breath as the cabin lights dimmed around her. The soft hum of the airplane's engines began to drown out the scattered chatter and clinking of glassware. And for the first time in months, she felt a sense of release. A well-earned break, her colleagues had insisted. Even now, as she smoothed the crisp lines of her white blouse and slipped her bag under the seat, the words felt foreign, almost indulgent. Vacation. The concept was as distant as it was elusive. At 36, Jada was no stranger to hard work. Born and raised in Harlem, she had learned early that her path would not be the one of least resistance. The daughter of a teacher and a nurse, Jada had felt the unspoken weight of expectation from a young age, a duty to rise above her circumstances and set a new standard, both for herself and for those who would follow. Through late nights and long hours, she had climbed the ranks from a Stanford scholarship student to a graduate of Harvard Medical School. She had endured, worked, and persevered, and here she was, one of the youngest trauma surgeons at New York Presbyterian Hospital. A title that carried both pride and exhaustion in equal measure. Yet, as Jada gazed out the window, watching the city lights blur below, she felt the familiar tension in her chest begin to ease. Just a little. It was as though she had been carrying something heavy for so long that she had forgotten what it was like to breathe without it. But even in this quiet moment, there lingered a tinge of something else, something darker and more stubborn. Like a stain on white fabric that refused to wash out. Jada knew it well. It was the feeling of never quite fitting, never quite being accepted, even as she checked every box and exceeded every standard. It wasn't new. In her field, she had seen the surprised looks, the barely concealed skepticism, the way her skill and intellect were sometimes treated as anomalies rather than the result of years of disciplined study and practice. A black woman in first class. A black woman as a surgeon, it was always there. The hint of disbelief. The subtle suggestion that she had somehow broken into a world that hadn't been made with her in mind. As the plane began to fill, Jada straightened, observing the passengers as they moved down the aisle, some glancing her way, others oblivious. She'd always been good at reading people's body language, micro-expressions, the subtle cues that spoke louder than words. She watched them with a quiet reserve, never revealing her thoughts, but always aware. Perhaps, she mused, it was a kind of armor, one she had learned to wear over the years, one that was as much a part of her as her stethoscope. The last few passengers filed in, and Jada's gaze drifted toward a man nearing her row. He was middle-aged, perhaps in his mid-50s, with a solid build and a suit that looked expensive but somehow ill-fitting, as though it had been chosen for status rather than comfort. His face was slightly flushed as he struggled to shove a large carry-on into the overhead compartment. Muttering under his breath as the bag teetered on the edge, Jada watched, feeling the faintest tug of sympathy, though she remained silent. Just as the bag looked ready to topple, she leaned forward, offering a calm, "Would you like some help with that?" The man glanced at her briefly, a flicker of annoyance crossing his face. "No, I've got it," he replied curtly, his voice edged with impatience. The tone was familiar, dismissive yet indifferent, a casual disregard she had encountered before. She pulled back, saying nothing more, and watched as a flight attendant appeared beside him, gently suggesting that his bag might need to be checked. His face darkened, irritation rising as he grumbled something about first-class standards under his breath, before finally relenting and allowing the attendant to take the bag. When he dropped into the seat beside Jada, she noticed his frame spilling slightly over the armrest, a subtle intrusion into her space, though she made no comment. "First class isn't what it used to be," he mumbled, loud enough for her to hear. Jada gave him a polite nod, neither encouraging nor discouraging the conversation. She had learned to pick her battles wisely. The man's gaze shifted to her, as though noticing her for the first time. His eyes narrowed, curiosity mingling with something else, something harder to define. "Right," he said slowly, his tone carrying a hint of sarcasm. "And what would you know about safety? You some kind of expert?" Jada felt the familiar twinge in her chest. A warning of sorts, though her expression remained composed. She met his gaze, her voice calm and measured. "Actually, I'm a trauma surgeon. Dr. Jada Reynolds. The man seemed taken aback, surprise flickering in his eyes. For a brief moment, he was silent, as though recalibrating his assumptions. Then, with a reluctant nod, he introduced himself. Travis Whitmore, he muttered, his tone softening slightly, though the skepticism hadn't quite left his expression. CEO of Whitmore Construction. There it was, the hesitation, the thinly veiled doubt, a look she had come to recognize. It was the expression of someone who wasn't quite sure how to reconcile the reality before them with the assumptions they had brought along. Jada had seen it before, and she knew it well. There was no anger in her, only a quiet resolve as she met his gaze, letting the silence stretch between them, a silence that held more than words. As the plane taxied down the runway, she turned away, her mind drifting back to the reason for this journey, a brief escape. A moment of peace. But even now, as the world outside blurred and faded, she felt the weight of her presence here, a silent challenge to the boundaries that had been drawn long before she arrived. And though she didn't know what awaited her in Miami, she knew this: every mile she traveled, every life she touched, was a step forward, a quiet defiance, and in her own way, a kind of freedom. As the plane leveled out and the hum of conversation faded into the steady drone of the engines, Dr. Jada Reynolds focused on the book she'd brought along, hoping to enjoy a few hours of quiet. Her seatmate, however, seemed to have other plans. Travis Whitmore, the man she had briefly assisted with his oversized luggage, shifted beside her, casting sidelong glances, clearly weighing whether to continue their earlier exchange. Jada kept her gaze fixed on the pages, her posture relaxed, giving no hint of the tension that had simmered between them. She had encountered men like him before, men of power, authority, accustomed to seeing the world ordered according to their comfort and expectations. She knew that her presence here, a young black woman in first class, seemed to defy those expectations. It was a subtle dissonance, barely spoken yet profoundly felt, a quiet discomfort that lingered in spaces where people carried with them unexamined assumptions. Finally, Travis cleared his throat, and Jada knew he was about to speak. "So, you're a trauma surgeon, huh?" His voice carried a casual skepticism, as though he were testing the truth of her claim. "That's impressive for someone your age." It was a statement she had heard many times before. The words themselves were not offensive, but the unspoken message was clear. The surprise, the doubt, the notion that her age and, perhaps, something else made her career somehow improbable. She kept her response measured. "Thank you," she said, glancing up with a polite smile. "I've been practicing for nearly a decade." Travis raised an eyebrow, his expression hovering between respect and disbelief. "And at New York Presbyterian, you said?" "That's right," Jada replied. "It's a demanding environment, but I'm grateful for the work I get to do." He nodded, though his gaze held a lingering wariness. She recognized it immediately, the look of a man who was still grappling with the idea that the person beside him could possess a title he might have associated with someone who looked very different. "It must be nice," he said after a moment, his voice slipping into a reflective tone. "Flying off to Miami for a vacation. I remember when I was starting out barely had enough for a weekend at the beach." He gave a small, knowing chuckle, as if to remind her of the dues he had once paid. Jada paused, considering her words. She could have explained the years of work, the sacrifices, the relentless pursuit of her career in a field that had never been particularly welcoming. But she only nodded. "I've saved for this trip. In a high-stress job, taking time to take care of yourself becomes essential." Travis gave a small, dismissive snort. "Self-care, right? That's what they're calling it these days." There was a faint, skeptical edge to his voice, as if he found the idea unnecessary, a luxury reserved for those who hadn't known hardship. Jada absorbed the comment in silence, her calm gaze steady. She had grown used to navigating these undercurrents of doubt, the subtle cues that revealed more about the person sitting beside her than any words could convey. To Travis, she was an anomaly, a disruption of what he believed to be a natural order. It was not an overt prejudice. He had not spoken with hostility or anger. Yet, in his tone, in the measured politeness of his words, she could feel the contours of an unspoken boundary, one he seemed reluctant to cross. After a moment, she turned back to her book, her interest in the conversation waning. The cabin settled into a lull, the muted light casting soft shadows over the faces of passengers as they drifted into quiet. But the silence between Jada and Travis was not comfortable. It held the tension of two worlds briefly intersecting. Two lives that had arrived here through vastly different paths, each carrying with them the weight of experiences the other could not fully comprehend. Perhaps that was the essence of it. Jada thought the unspoken differences that lingered beneath the surface, never quite acknowledged, yet deeply felt. It was as if they had both brought their own stories to this shared space. But only one of them was expected to listen. The flight continued, a quiet testament to the distances that remained unbridged, to the silent divides that permeated the world around them. Even here, 35,000 feet in the air. And as Jada sat there, calm and composed, she knew that these boundaries were not hers to overcome. She had already proven herself. It was up to others to see it. The flight had settled into a peaceful rhythm. Passengers were leaning back, some drifting off, others absorbed in books or in-flight movies. Outside, the sky stretched into an endless blue, clouds passing beneath them like distant memories. Dr. Jada Reynolds felt herself relaxing, allowing her mind to settle. But her peace was, once again, interrupted by a subtle movement beside her. Travis Whitmore, her seatmate, was shifting in his seat, casting sidelong glances her way. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation in his manner, a sense that he wanted to say something but couldn't quite find the words. After a moment, he cleared his throat, breaking the silence between them. "So, tell me," he began, his tone slightly guarded. "Why trauma surgery?" Jada turned, meeting his gaze with a steady calm. It was a question she had been asked before, though usually by those who sought to understand her passion, not by those looking for something else, some hidden motive. Perhaps, as if her choice of career required justification. "Because it's challenging," she answered simply, "and because the work is needed. In trauma surgery, you have a chance to make a difference. Sometimes when it seems like all hope is lost." Travis nodded slowly, but there was a shadow of skepticism in his eyes. He seemed to weigh her answer as if searching for something beneath the surface. Something that might align with his assumptions. "I guess I can understand that," he replied, his tone still distant. "But, don't you ever feel out of place? In a field like that? I mean, it's competitive." The question hung in the air, carrying with it a layer of meaning that neither of them directly acknowledged. Jada knew what he was asking. Or rather, what he wasn't asking directly. It was a question she had felt in many conversations. In the way some people's voices would drop slightly. The way their eyes would narrow. As if trying to reconcile her success with her appearance. "Of course," Jada answered, her tone neutral. "It's a demanding field, and it's not always easy. But I didn't choose this path expecting it to be easy." He gave a small, thoughtful nod, still watching her with that look, a mix of curiosity and reluctance. A fascination that seemed to sit uncomfortably within him. "I suppose you'd have to be tough," he mused, his voice softening just slightly. Not many people would willingly put themselves through that kind of pressure. Jada allowed herself a faint smile, feeling the weight of her own story. She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. She knew that her presence alone carried a silent message, a reminder that people often overlooked the strength, resilience, and resolve it took to exist in spaces where one's presence was questioned or doubted. There was a pause, and then Travis glanced away, looking out the window as though lost in thought. "You know," he said quietly, almost to himself, "things weren't like this when I was starting out. It was just simpler. People knew their place." The words were spoken softly, almost nostalgically, as if he was reminiscing about a time he remembered fondly. Jada held her silence, choosing not to respond immediately, letting his words linger in the air between them. She could sense his struggle, his grappling with a world that was shifting, changing in ways he hadn't expected. To him, knowing one's place was a kind of order, a comfortable understanding, but to her, it was a boundary, a limitation, a restriction on who she could be. "Maybe that's the challenge," she said finally, her voice gentle but unwavering. "Learning to see things differently, even when it's uncomfortable. Maybe it's about learning to let people define their own place. On their own terms. Travis didn't respond immediately. He shifted slightly, his brow furrowing as he processed her words. It was as though, for a moment, he glimpsed something beyond his familiar perspective. Something that challenged the lens through which he viewed the world. The silence between them deepened, filled not with hostility but with a quiet understanding. It was the silence of two people from different worlds, each standing on the edge of their own beliefs, each feeling the weight of the space between them. As the plane flew on, Jada felt a subtle change in the air, a quiet awareness, a mutual recognition that while they might never fully understand each other's experiences, they could at least sit with the discomfort, acknowledge it, and perhaps even respect it. The cabin was quiet. A sense of calm had finally settled. The hum of the engines a steady background as passengers dozed or read. Dr. Jada Reynolds had returned to her book, her mind wandering somewhere between the words on the page and the peaceful anticipation of her first vacation in years. Then, somewhere toward the front of the cabin, there was a faint sound, a cough, a stifled gasp, then the unmistakable thud of something hitting the floor. Heads began to turn, eyes opening. As people looked toward the source of the noise, Jada's gaze lifted, her attention narrowing in on the scene taking place just a few rows ahead. A man in his 50s, seated near the front, was slumped forward, clutching his chest, his face pale and drenched in sweat. His breathing was shallow, labored, each breath a struggle. Passengers nearby were frozen, uncertainty and fear clear in their eyes. Without a second thought, Jada unbuckled her seatbelt and stood, her movements calm, almost practiced. "Excuse me," she said, slipping past Travis, who looked at her with surprise, as if he too was taken aback by her sudden movement. She made her way down the aisle with purpose, her voice firm and steady as she called out to the flight attendants. "I'm a doctor. Let me help." The flight attendants, momentarily relieved to have a professional on board, nodded and stepped aside, allowing Jada to kneel beside the man. His breathing was shallow, his face tense with pain, his hand clutched tightly over his chest. "Sir," Jada said gently, her voice steady and reassuring. "I need you to stay calm. I'm going to help you." He looked at her, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. But he nodded, trying to focus on her voice. Jada turned to the flight attendant beside her. "I need the first aid kit. Any aspirin. And if there's nitroglycerin on board, bring that too." The attendant nodded, rushing to gather what Jada needed. And another passenger, a nurse, joined her side, offering assistance. Together, they worked with practiced efficiency, tending to the man as the cabin settled into a tense silence. The usual hum of idle chatter had ceased entirely. Now, all eyes were on Jada, watching as she moved with calm authority. Among the onlookers was Travis. From her peripheral vision, Jada could see him watching. His face a blend of surprise and something else, perhaps awe. Perhaps something more difficult to articulate. This was not the same woman he had seen as an anomaly, a disruption to the status quo. This was Dr. Jada Reynolds, a woman entirely in command, her competence and composure undeniable. As Jada worked, she felt a quiet satisfaction in the silence surrounding her. The skepticism, the questioning glances, the hesitations, all of it had faded into the background. In this moment, she was simply the doctor, the person people trusted to take control, the one they believed could make things right. And it was a role she knew well, one she had earned through years of study, sacrifice, and resilience. When the man's breathing finally began to steady, and his pain seemed to ease, there was a collective release of breath throughout the cabin. A soft murmur of relief rippled through the rows, and someone started to clap, the sound quickly taken up by others. A ripple of gratitude and admiration. Jada, feeling the warmth of accomplishment, rose to her feet, nodding to the nurse and the flight attendants as they took over the situation from there. She turned, heading back to her seat, the tension in her shoulders slowly melting away. As she returned to her row, Travis sat stiffly, his gaze following her, his expression unreadable. He shifted slightly as she sat down, his hands fidgeting, and after a long silence, he spoke. "Dr. Reynolds," he began, his voice quiet, almost hesitant. I didn't realize." He stopped, as if searching for the right words. His gaze fixed somewhere just beyond her. I didn't think. Jada met his eyes, calm and composed. Yet there was a hint of something firmer in her gaze. A quiet challenge that didn't need words. Maybe, she said softly, her tone as steady as ever. You'll think twice next time before making assumptions. There was no anger in her voice. No bitterness. Only a measured patience. A reminder that the weight of her presence in spaces like this was a constant. That her competence did not need to be proven. Though time and again she had been asked to do so. Travis looked away, a flicker of regret in his eyes. And for the rest of the flight, he was unusually silent, his posture more reserved, his usual confidence tempered by something softer. Something more introspective. When the plane finally began its descent into Miami, the cabin lights brightened, and passengers shifted, gathering their belongings. But as Jada prepared to step off the plane, she felt lighter, more resolute. The silence she left behind was, in its own way, a victory, a quiet reminder of the power she carried, and the quiet dignity with which she chose to carry it. As the plane descended, preparing for its final approach into Miami, Dr. Jada Reynolds sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the soft orange glow of the horizon. She felt a rare sense of calm, a quiet satisfaction that settled over her as she reflected on the events of the flight. The man she had helped was resting comfortably, stabilized, his condition under control. There was nothing particularly extraordinary in what she had done, it was simply the work she was trained to do. But the quiet nods of appreciation and relief she'd seen in the eyes of her fellow passengers. Even Travis Whitmore's surprised expression lingered with her. Beside her, Travis shifted in his seat, his usual confident posture slightly slouched, as though weighed down by a thought he couldn't quite shake. For the first time since their interaction had begun, he seemed unsure, hesitant, his words caught somewhere between reluctance and realization. He cleared his throat, glancing at her sidelong. Dr. Reynolds, he began, his voice softer, devoid of the brash tone she had grown accustomed to. There was something more vulnerable in his manner, a hint of discomfort mingling with what seemed like genuine regret. I just wanted to say I didn't realize. He paused, searching for words, as though trying to piece together a thought that wasn't easy to express. Jada met his gaze, her expression calm and patient, giving him the space to find his voice. She had seen this before, the way people grappled with confronting their own assumptions. The uncomfortable reckoning with a perspective that, until then, had seemed so certain. Travis sighed, looking down at his hands. I didn't think someone like you. He stopped himself, his face flushing slightly, realizing how the words might sound. I mean, I guess I had my own assumptions. I didn't think someone so young. And he trailed off, his gaze drifting to the window, almost as if embarrassed by the things he could no longer ignore about his own outlook. Jada nodded slightly, understanding what he couldn't quite articulate. She knew that his struggle was not just about her profession, her age, or even her presence in first class. It was about something deeper, an ingrained perception that had been challenged by reality. She sensed the unspoken realization dawning on him, the quiet acknowledgement that his judgment had been shaped by boundaries he had never questioned. Travis took a deep breath, his voice lowering. I guess what I'm trying to say is, I'm sorry, I was wrong to make those assumptions about you. And to be honest, I didn't even realize I was doing it. I was raised differently, and old habits die hard. He looked at her then, his expression sincere, his gaze steady, as if finally willing to confront the discomfort he had avoided for so long. Jada could feel the weight of his apology, not just as an attempt at amends but as a quiet acknowledgement of the changes he needed to make in himself. She considered her response carefully. Mr. Whitmore, she began, her voice steady but gentle. It's not just about an apology. It's about understanding why those assumptions existed in the first place. We all have blind spots. But the challenge is to look at them, to see where they come from, and to choose differently moving forward. Travis nodded, taking in her words, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. For a moment, the age difference, the social distance between them, seemed to dissolve, leaving only a shared moment of human reflection. He looked down, his face showing traces of something close to shame, as though realizing the work he had left to do. "You're right," he said softly, almost to himself. "I never really thought about it before. I don't know why I make these assumptions. Maybe it's just habit. Maybe it's just easy." Jada offered him a small, understanding nod, knowing that his reflection, however halting, was a step toward a broader awareness. She didn't need him to change overnight, she only needed him to acknowledge the possibility that change was necessary. As the plane touched down, wheels skimming the runway, Travis turned to her once more, his tone quieter, more thoughtful. "Thank you, Dr. Reynolds," he said, a note of respect in his voice that hadn't been there before. "For everything, not just for what you did up there, but for giving me something to think about." Jada gave him a slight smile, a simple gesture that conveyed her acceptance of his apology and perhaps even her hope for his growth. "I hope you do think about it," she replied gently. "The world changes when people are willing to see it differently." As they taxied toward the gate, Travis sat back, his expression contemplative, a man quietly reckoning with a life's worth of unexamined beliefs. Jada, too, felt a sense of quiet accomplishment, not the kind that stemmed from recognition or applause, but from a deeper satisfaction, knowing that she had, in her own way, planted a seed, and as she prepared to step off the plane, her heart felt lighter, her resolve strengthened. She had not set out to change anyone's mind, yet perhaps, in her calm resistance to judgment, she had done just that. The cabin lights flickered back to life as the plane taxied toward the gate, a soft chime signaling the end of their journey. But then, a calm voice came over the intercom, informing passengers that they would be temporarily disembarking due to the unexpected landing prompted by the earlier medical emergency. The delay was met with the usual quiet sighs of annoyance, the rustle of bags being gathered, and the murmurs of travel-weary passengers resigned to yet another pause in their plans. Dr. Jada Reynolds stood up, stretched, and quietly observed her surroundings. Her gaze drifted to Travis Whitmore, who was looking at her with a thoughtful, almost hesitant expression. He cleared his throat as he gathered his belongings, as if he had something more he wanted to say but wasn't sure how to begin. After a moment, he gestured toward the gate with a nod. "Would you mind grabbing a cup of coffee with me?" he asked, his tone softer than she had yet heard. "It's on me, consider it a thank you, maybe even a small apology." Jada paused, studying him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right," she agreed, her voice calm. "Coffee sounds good." They made their way into the terminal, settling into a quiet corner of an airport cafe. Outside, a drizzle tapped against the windows, the soft patter of rain adding to the calm that had settled over the crowd waiting in the terminal. Travis ordered their coffee, black for him, a simple latte for her, and they sat across from each other in comfortable silence for a few minutes, each seeming to gather their thoughts. Finally, Travis broke the silence, his voice carrying a note of vulnerability. "You know, Dr. Reynolds, Jada, I've been thinking about what you said. About assumptions. About seeing things differently." He paused, looking down into his coffee cup as though it held the words he was searching for. "I guess I never really thought much about how my own ideas might impact others. In construction, I've been in charge, running the show, setting the standards. I didn't stop to think how my view of the world might limit what I see in other people." Jada listened, her expression thoughtful. She wasn't surprised by his admission after all. Many people moved through the world without ever stopping to question the beliefs they'd inherited, the perspectives they'd formed through years of routine and familiarity. But there was something refreshing in hearing him acknowledge it so plainly. "It's easy to get comfortable with our own perspective," she replied gently, her voice carrying that steady calm she always maintained. "But sometimes, that comfort makes it difficult to see beyond what we know. And that's where those subtle assumptions come from, even if we don't mean them to harm." He nodded, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "I suppose I've always thought of myself as fair. I've worked hard, earned my place." But, his voice trailed off, as though he was hesitant to say the next part, to admit something even to himself. "But I never really considered that others people like you might have to work harder just to get a seat at the same table." She met his gaze, a small, quiet smile crossing her face. It's not always obvious, is it? There's no manual for understanding what others go through. But awareness is the first step. Once we see it, we can start to change it. In our own ways. Travis took a slow sip of his coffee, nodding, as though weighing her words. I don't think I'll ever fully understand what it's like to walk in your shoes, he admitted, his voice laced with an honesty that felt rare and unguarded. But I can try to look at things with fresh eyes. To be more aware of the assumptions I'm making. Jada allowed his words to settle, appreciating the sincerity she sensed in them. She didn't need grand gestures or declarations, she valued the small steps. The willingness to see and acknowledge what had previously gone unseen. It was those moments, those quiet realizations, that often led to lasting change. They sat there, sharing the silence, the conversation, an unspoken bridge between their different worlds. She knew this conversation would not erase years of learned prejudice or societal bias. But perhaps it was enough to begin the unlearning. To encourage Travis to see that there was more than one way to measure someone's worth. After a moment, she glanced at him, a faint smile in her eyes. You know, Mr. Whitmore, she said gently, change doesn't happen overnight, but each small step matters. Awareness, intention, those are what move us forward. He nodded, his expression softened, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for your patience, and for helping me see that I still have a lot to learn. With that, the quiet between them felt different, less an uncomfortable silence. More a space of mutual respect. A quiet recognition of the journey that lay ahead. One step at a time. As the announcement for boarding sounded overhead, they rose, ready to continue toward their respective destinations, each carrying with them a subtle but profound shift in perspective. And as they walked back to the gate, Jada felt a quiet satisfaction. She had come on this trip seeking rest. A break from the demands of her work. But perhaps, in this small, unexpected encounter, she had found something more valuable. The reminder that even in the smallest interactions, change could begin, one conversation at a time. As the plane resumed its journey to Miami, the cabin was filled with a quiet hum. The soft sounds of passengers settling back into their seats. Dr. Jada Reynolds leaned back, gazing out at the vast expanse of sky, feeling a sense of stillness settle over her. Her brief conversation with Travis Whitmore in the terminal lingered in her mind. An encounter that was both unexpected and strangely significant. Travis, seated beside her, seemed equally contemplative. He was no longer the brash, assured man she had first encountered. Confident in his assumptions and settled in his views. Now, he appeared softened, reflective, as if he had opened a door to thoughts he hadn't considered before. His expression was one of quiet introspection. A look Jada had seen in others before, people who, after years of certainty, had encountered something that made them pause and reconsider. After a moment, Travis glanced over at her. His voice softer, no longer carrying the hint of skepticism she'd come to expect from him. You know, he said, breaking the silence, I've spent most of my life in rooms where people looked like me. Thought like me. I never questioned it. I thought that's just how things were. Jada nodded, her expression calm and understanding. It's easy to think that way when the world around us seems to agree with our perspective. She replied gently, we assume that what we experience is universal. It's comfortable to believe that everyone has the same access, the same opportunities, but that comfort can also be a kind of blindness. Travis sighed, his gaze drifting away, his face thoughtful. I see that now. I can't pretend I fully understand what it's like to be, well, in your position, but I do see how my own perspective has kept me from seeing the bigger picture. He paused, his voice almost a whisper. I feel like I've missed something important all these years. Jada watched him carefully, sensing the sincerity in his words. She knew that these realizations didn't come easily, especially for someone like Travis, who had built his life on foundations of self-assurance and authority. But there was a quiet courage in his admission, an acknowledgement that he was ready, perhaps, to shift his perspective, to look at the world through a lens he had not considered before. You know, Jada said slowly, recognizing it as the first step. It's not about changing overnight. It's about noticing, listening, Being willing to understand without assuming you already have all the answers. Travis nodded, his face softening as he absorbed her words. It's humbling, he admitted, a touch of vulnerability in his tone. I always thought I was fair. That I gave people a chance. But maybe I've been seeing them through a filter I didn't even know I had. They sat in silence for a moment, both of them looking out at the clouds passing by, suspended in the quiet intimacy of shared understanding. Jada didn't need an apology from Travis, and she certainly didn't need his approval. What mattered was that he was seeing the world a little differently. That he had taken a step toward understanding his own biases and how they shaped his actions. After a long pause, Travis spoke again, his voice thoughtful. I want to take what I've learned from this, from you, and bring it back with me. To my work, my company, my life. I think it's time I start making room for perspectives that aren't my own. Jada looked at him, a faint smile in her eyes, a quiet pride in her gaze. She had not set out to change him, nor had she intended to open his eyes to anything in particular. But through their shared journey, through the unexpected moments of reflection, she had seen a shift in him that was rare and real. And that, she knew, was enough. Awareness, she said gently, leads to action. The more we notice, the more we can change. And sometimes, it's the smallest shifts that make the biggest difference. As the flight continued, Jada and Travis sat side by side, both of them enveloped in a calm that came from understanding, from a quiet but powerful connection that crossed lines of experience, race, and perspective. They didn't need to say more, there was an unspoken acknowledgement between them. A recognition that they had both left this flight a little different from when they had boarded. And as Jada watched the clouds roll by, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. A reminder of the quiet power of resilience, patience, and the courage to stay true to oneself. Even in the face of doubt and skepticism, she knew that this small encounter, this unexpected connection, was a testament to the change that could begin, even in the most ordinary moments. As they approached Miami, Jada looked at Travis one last time, a gentle warmth in her expression. Thank you for listening, she said simply. Sometimes, that's all it takes to start. Travis nodded, a hint of gratitude in his eyes. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, for more than you know. And as the plane began its descent, Jada felt a quiet satisfaction settle over her, knowing that perhaps, in her own way, she had planted a seed that, with time and patience, could grow into something meaningful, something that might ripple out into the world far beyond this flight. The plane touched down in Miami with a gentle jolt, and a murmur of movement filled the cabin as passengers reached for their bags. Prepared to step into the warmth of the city, Dr. Jada Reynolds took a moment, letting the feeling of finality settle over her. This journey had been intended as an escape, a chance to step away from her demanding world. Yet it had offered her something far more profound, a reminder of resilience, of quiet transformation, of the power in simply being present. Beside her, Travis Whitmore gathered his belongings, his movements uncharacteristically unhurried. She could sense his reluctance, a quiet hesitation, as if there were things left unsaid, thoughts still unformed yet meaningful. As they stepped into the aisle, Travis cleared his throat and looked at her. His expression softened, perhaps even humbled. Dr. Reynolds, he began, his voice carrying a note of gravity. I want you to know that I appreciate our conversation. I didn't expect this flight to leave me with so much to think about. Jada nodded, her face calm, understanding. Sometimes, it's the unexpected moments that stay with us the longest, she replied gently. They walked through the jet bridge in silence, the busy airport ahead coming into view with its bustling crowds and the soft din of travelers moving through their own stories. Once they reached the terminal, they paused, sharing one final moment amidst the crowd. Travis's gaze held a sincerity that hadn't been there before, a quiet acknowledgement of his own limitations, of the small yet significant steps he was now willing to take. Thank you, Dr. Reynolds, he said, his tone filled with quiet conviction. For more than just helping that man, you've given me a new way of seeing things. I think I'll be a different man because of it. Jada offered him a slight, understanding smile. We're all learning, she said simply. Each day brings the chance to look at the world anew. I hope you carry that with you. For a moment, they stood there, two people from different worlds, connected by a shared experience and a mutual respect that defied the unspoken boundaries they had each brought with them. And then, with a small nod, Travis extended his hand. Jada took it, feeling the weight of a quiet promise in his grasp. The unspoken understanding that real change is slow and humble, unfolding not in grand gestures but in the smallest, simplest of moments. As she watched him walk away, blending into the flow of the crowd, she felt a calm, steady satisfaction. There was no triumph in it, no sense of victory, only the quiet knowing that she had done what she always did, remained true to herself, uphold her values, and let the rest follow. Stepping out into the humid Miami air, Jada inhaled deeply, feeling the warmth of the sun against her skin. The beginning of a new day stretching before her. She had come here seeking rest, a break from the relentless pace of her life. And yet she had found something more, a reminder that even in the smallest encounters, change could be planted like a seed, left to grow quietly, reshaping minds and perspectives one small shift at a time. And as she walked toward the exit, the airport bustling around her, she felt a gentle certainty settle within her. She had left an impression, one that might ripple beyond this one man, beyond this single flight. It was a reminder that strength did not always need to be loud. That change could begin in the quietest exchanges. A word here, a shared glance there. For Jada, it was enough. Enough to know that she had walked her path, that her presence had spoken for itself. And as she disappeared into the warm Miami morning, her heart was light, her spirit unburdened, carrying forward the quiet, powerful strength that had brought her this far.